Okay, hello folks, and welcome back to part two of my Research in the Home Forces tutorials. In this one, we're going to have a very basic look at some simple sources of information. And the aim of this is just to, it's not going to be all exhaustive and point you towards every single source of information. It's just going to be a very brief overview of some of the things that you can look out for when starting out your research. As with the previous video, this video is part of a series that's been very kindly supported by funding from the Norfolk and Norwich Archaeological Society. Um, as I mentioned in the first video, I put in a funding grant to fund a body of research looking into the Second World War anti-invasion defence of Thetford, and NNAS have been absolutely fantastic in providing me some funding. And one of the outcomes of this funding bid is for me to kind of produce a series of videos looking at the methods I use to research these defences. So everything I'm going to be doing at the minute is desk-based. So consulting sources of information and building up a picture using desk-based resources. As an archaeologist, the impression is often that we go out in the field and do everything outdoors and dig holes and stuff. But a vast amount of archaeological work involves sitting at a desk and tapping away at a computer. And yeah, this research that I'm undertaking is no different from that. I might get out in the fields in the future, but that's a video maybe as part of another series when I do start to get out and about. Anyway, let's get into this video, and I'm going to try and remember what I've put into these slides. So let's start with avoiding common pitfalls. So there are a lot of people that start out looking at the home forces but don't tend to get too far. And all of this comes down to not knowing where to go for information, or consulting the wrong places and not finding information, and then kind of giving up because they haven't found any information. And kind of one of the unfortunate things about this is that this is nothing new. And in the 1980s, a chap called Henry Wills, who wrote the book Pillboxes, which was kind of like one of the first studies and publications looking at pillboxes in the Second World War and First World War. And one of the unfortunate things about his research is that he didn't find any source of information held in various archives, and he came to the conclusion that no, well, to put it in his words, he says here that local inquiries only led to the discovery of more in the locality. But at national level, neither the Imperial War Museum, the Royal Engineers Institute, nor the Ministry of Defence could supply any details of design or where they were sited in relation to pillboxes. I was referred to the only sketch map published in defence of the UK by the HMSO, which was not very informative or accurate. The towns of Basingstoke and Aldershot being transposed for a start. It became clear that, and this is the key part, it became clear that there was no national record of sites, defence lines, or even designs of pillboxes. No doubt the pressure of work in 1940 prevented too much paperwork being filed, and the end of the defence regulations and the birth of the Property Services Agency in place of Royal Engineers Work Services contributed to a clear out of all documents. That is massively unfortunate. Because the opposite is true. There was a vast amount of records kept, which we'll look at in a later video. But unfortunately, that book by Wills is still quite highly regarded. It's a good book, but it's been superseded by more recent studies, and unfortunately, people see that and just copy the fact or what he thought was that no records were kept, so they don't bother looking for records. And another pitfall is that people, as Wills did in the 1980s, contact places like the Ministry of Defence and the Imperial War Museum, who don't keep documents relating to the Home Force or the anti-invasion defences. It's as simple as that. We'll see where these records are kept later on, but yeah, that's just something to be aware of, is that a lot of people set out to do research into the Home Forces, can't find any information because they look at local archives or contact the IWM, and therefore assume that no records were kept, when the opposite is true. There are over, well, I'll cover this later. Anyway, so let's start by looking at some of these sources of information that I recommend. And I have done another video on this. If you look out for my recommended reads video or something like that, I'll post a link in the description below. So, national studies. From my experience, there are very few reliable national studies or published works that look at the whole picture of the UK in terms of the home forces and the defence of the UK during the Second World War. So I'm going to use the word reliable a lot in this video, and it's not to say there are very few sources which cover the national picture in the required detail. It's more the fact that a lot of the national work looking at the national picture don't provide references to the source of information, which is quite problematic. So to save you a lot of time and potentially money, if you're going out or want to go out and buy a load of books, don't bother. I recommend these two sources of information. So I recommend finding a copy of the Council of British Archaeology report, which was titled, if you're in England, this is 20th Century Fortifications in England, Volume 2, which was by Colin Dobinson and produced for the Council by the Council for British Archaeology. And then if you're outside of England, I recommend finding a copy of 20th Century Fortifications in the United Kingdom by Neil Redfern. Again, these were both produced by the Council of British Archaeology in the mid-90s. And one of the unfortunate things about these is that they weren't widely published. So some of these found that the hard copies found their way to historic environment records in the UK, in some cases libraries, but unfortunately they weren't more widely published. And in terms of Dobinson's report and the one by Redfern as well, this is massively unfortunate because both of these reports show that there is a vast amount of information held elsewhere in regards to the Home Forces and anti-invasion defences, and if these had been published, a lot of people would, over the past, it's nearly 30 years ago now since these were published, a lot of people would have avoided the common pitfalls of not finding anything and assuming that no records were kept. So, yeah, try and find a copy of these. If you contact the Council for British Archaeology, they may be able to help you find a PDF copy of these reports, and they are well worth getting, as both provide an accurate introduction and summary of the Home Forces, and in particular Dobinson's report breaks down by each command in the UK, which I'll cover in more detail later, what activity was going on, and gives you a very good chronological summary of what was happening at a very local level. Both these reports are also fully referenced, which is massively important because this makes it much easier to identify archive documents and other primary sources of information to aid your research. And the reports also provide gazetteers of sources of information as well, which will save you a lot of time in terms of finding source of information from a later source, which we'll cover later. So next we have local studies. So again, local studies are relatively uncommon when it comes to the Home Forces, and yeah, unfortunately very few are properly researched or presented. So you can find some local studies, but they, from my perspective, the vast majority are just like almost like picture books, which are just like, this is a site, here it is, this is another site, here it is, rather than a cohesive analysis of what was going on at a local level. These are two that I recommend. So if you're in Scotland, get a copy of Dr. Gordon Barclay's If Hitler Comes. This alongside A Very Dangerous Locality by Rob Lydiard and David Sims, Dr. Rob Lydiard and David Sims, are pretty much the two best examples of how to do research into the Home Forces and the anti-invasion defences and how to present that. These are both fantastic books, and they are actually well worth getting even if you're not based in Scotland or in Suffolk. They're excellent examples to have as a way as a guide to how you should present your information if you do wish to do a book or something like that. Absolutely fantastic books and well worth the money. Excuse me. So, as I've already said, there are local studies, but very few of these are properly researched. So, especially in cases of these, in the case of these two, both authors here, so both Rob Lydiard and David Sims and Gordon Barclay provide full references for their work here. And if you're working at a local level, as I recommended in the first video, picking a small area and starting small. Books such as this, where they provide the references, can provide you with some very handy clues and sources of documents. Yeah, but be aware that you should also keep a list of your sources and properly reference any source of information you consult, especially published sources. So what you want to do as you go through, as I'll highlight later, is keep a record of which source of information you are consulting as well. But yeah, examples of localized study like these, where they provide you with a vast range of references, are a useful stepping stone to starting your research, and will give you some clues at a local level about what documents you need to consult in the future to do your own research. Yeah, I'm going to cover the importance of references later, so I'm not going to mention that in too much more detail. The next, we have the National Archives, and this is where, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people don't bother checking, unfortunately. But the National Archives hold all the Home Forces war diaries and all the command files. So these are all the primary sources relating to the defence of the UK during the Second World War. And as I pointed out at the beginning with Wills, he went to the MOD and the Imperial War Museum and didn't find anything, and then concluded that no documents were kept. The opposite is true. There were over, I can't remember now. I did if you go on my website, I did a pillbox myth looking at this, and there's something like 6,000 records or individual records and files held within the National Archives which relate to the defence of the UK during the Second World War, primarily the Home Forces and command files. I'm going to cover this in more detail in a separate video because how you consult this information is quite specific, and I want to cover that in more detail in a single video to show you how to find source of information via the National Archives catalogue here. But again, we'll cover this in more information, but this is where you need to go to find your primary sources. So if you intend to do serious research in the Home Forces, there is no avoiding it. You are inevitably going to end up sourcing documents from the National Archives based in Kew, and there's no way of avoiding this. Whether you visit in person or hire a researcher to get the documents on your behalf, as I do, I'll highlight a couple of people that do this in a later video, you will have some interaction with the National Archives or the TNA. So yeah, as I've already said, I'm going to cover this in more detail in a separate video because there are several things you need to know about where to find information and how to search the National Archives catalogue online before going there or hiring someone to go there in person. But yeah, we'll look at this in more detail in a separate video, in probably the next video. Right, the importance of references. So I've titled this Evidence and Useful Pointers. So this is just going to be a quick summary of why references are important. So authors who produce publications that provide their references are worth seeking out, as I mentioned with the localized studies earlier on. References, for those of you who don't know, are summaries of the sources of information, often documents or sources of, often documents that someone has consulted to do their research and draw conclusions and put together their research. These are often primary sources of information, and I like to think of primary sources as the foundation of a wall, so these give you a basis on which to build your wall of research. And, by consulting and showing your references, you are proving what you are saying primarily. So I now keep an eye out for whether sources are provided in a document, because if sources are not provided, then it's hard to tell if the person who's written something is right, who's written something is actually writing something that's based in historical facts and based on primary sources, or if it's just their opinion. So you'll often find the references kept in a section at the end of a chapter or a book, or as footnotes at the bottom of a page, as seen here. So these are just examples of footnotes. So the one at the top is footnotes at the bottom of a page, and the other is a list of sources held at the back end of a chapter. And this is how you'll generally find these. So in this case, TNA W0205/1C is National Archives, and that's the reference. But we'll look at how to trace these later, and then you've also got the date as well, which is particularly useful. But this gives you a good idea that the person who has written this has consulted primary source of information, and they basically know what they're talking about, or they've based their research on actual fact. So by providing research, as an author is pretty much showing what source of information they've consulted to make their assessments and conclusions. It's a bit like, and I hate maths, but this is a decent analogy, it's a bit like showing you're working out when you're doing maths. It shows that how you have come to the conclusion that you've come to. And it's worth knowing as well, unfortunately, there are authors out there who don't provide their references and sources, which unfortunately makes it impossible to corroborate what they are saying. This is a particular issue when errors and mistakes in their publications are found, which I've come across a couple of times, as it makes it impossible to work out where they got these errors from, where these errors originated from, and it makes it difficult for me, at least, to trust anything else they've written. If they are making errors and then not backing up, showing where they found this information, it makes it difficult then for me to trust what they're writing. And I tend to avoid authors who do that now, relying heavily on primary sources or only trusted sources of information where references are provided. So as I mentioned earlier, in the case of the CBA reports, or the Council for British Archaeology reports, and the local studies I pointed out earlier, the references that they provide can act as a foundational stepping stone for your own research, which is why I've put this down as useful pointers. So if you are starting out and you want to try and get an idea of which documents you should look at, obviously we'll cover this later because there's other sources, but publications that provide you with their references make it easier to identify primary sources which you can consult to undertake your research. It'll make things a lot easier for you. So in my case, the Council of British Archaeology reports have helped me immensely and helped me gain a running start in terms of my research. I started research only, well, doing the documentary research about within the last 10 years, and the Dobinson reports and the Redfern report have been vitally important to helping me get a head start and also helping me avoid the pitfalls that other people have fallen into. So next up we have keeping track of sources. So as you start your research, you want to start thinking about keeping track of the source of information that you are consulting. It's best to keep track of your source of information as soon as possible, as soon as you start. And this will help you to keep on top of which sources you have sourced and which source of information you have consulted. You'll potentially struggle if you do all your research and then don't keep track of your source of information you have consulted. It's worth pointing out here that a massive unfortunate thing is that a lot of so-called research, especially presented online, comprises of just copying the work of others and presenting it as your own information and just repeating that information verbatim, which has caused a lot of issues in terms of the accuracy of information and how much we know about the Home Force today. So one of the things that I see is several myths that you see repeated on an almost daily or weekly basis online, which have no basis in fact. And when you start to do some research, you can clearly see that these are complete myth, and you can prove that they're mythology as well. So yeah, unfortunately online, a lot of people who say they do research are literally just copying the work of others, and in more extreme cases are crediting the work to the person that found the source of information rather than the actual published source that the person found the information in, which is a massive shame, but it's a key problem with, like I say, supposed research into anti-invasion defences, in particular online. So this causes issues, especially when information is done without reference to the original authors. It's plagiarism. It's very serious, especially if you're looking to publish your work as well. If you're copying the work of others, it's extremely bad taste and bad form. And if you go on to publish work that is clearly the work of others, you are going to get yourself in some serious trouble. So by keeping track of your sources, you can get a running start, and this helps you avoid plagiarism. And actively avoiding plagiarism is vitally important for not only professional researchers but also amateur historians and researchers. So just to summarise, like, plagiarism itself is copying someone else's work and either passing it off as your own or as someone else's work. And again, as I've said, this is massively unprofessional, but something that's relatively common in particular online. So some of the cases I see quite frequently, in particular online, are where people will copy and paste text from historic environment records relating to pillboxes and the like, or copy things like Historic England listing documents, and then they copy and paste this information without providing any credit to the original source or even providing links to the original source where they've taken that information. The idea is that it potentially makes them look more knowledgeable than they actually are, when all they've done is copied someone else's work and presented it as their own. In more extreme cases, there are people as well out there who are quite happy to take information from a published source, such as a book, and then over time credit that information to another source to make it look like the person that copied the data from a book actually found the information. So there's been a couple of cases where there's someone who's particularly prolific who has copied a load of information out of a book and then credited this information to aerial photographs to make it look like they found the information, when the reality is they've copied the information from someone else's work. So that is absolutely disgusting, and extremely serious in terms of being, the unprofessional nature of this. This also causes several issues as well. If you're looking to publish your work or provide it to others or professional heritage bodies such as Historic Environment Records, this is extremely dangerous, as it makes it look like you've gathered that information and also doesn't provide the person you send the information to with the original source of information, so they can't corroborate it. But yeah, it's worth being aware of this, that plagiarism is particularly rife online. So if you're going to post stuff online, it's going to get ripped off eventually by someone who doesn't care and just wants to make themselves look clever. Another issue with not providing sources and plagiarism, it makes it difficult to corroborate and prove what someone is saying, and leads to the formation of myths. So, you know, if you go on my website, you'll see I've done a little blog series called Pillbox Myths, and most of these myths surrounding pillboxes today have come about through this lack of researching and plagiarism, as well as people not actually reading the sources they are quoting. So, you know, a lot of the time, mythology is created by people either not understanding what they're sharing or just copying and pasting other people's words without corroborating it. So yeah, showing your references also shows that you are doing things properly and looks better for you. So, you know, if you want to be as professional as possible, even if you're just starting out, keep track of your source of information. So I'm always happy to admit this, that I've always struggled with referencing. Once you get your head around it, though, it is quite straightforward. And from my experience, you know, I've always struggled with writing references out to specific formats, like the Harvard referencing system, for example. It just ties my brain in knots. But I found several apps which have been helpful over the years. And, you know, this is just how I approach keeping track of my source of information and providing references in the documents that I write and the reports that I write. So you might find other ways of doing this, such as keeping a simple document on your computer or even keeping a notebook of information. But here are my personally preferred methods. So take a look at Zotero. So if you go to zotero.org, this is a really useful little program which helps you keep track of bibliographic references, websites, sources of information such as secondary sources, reports, a whole range of things. And in some cases you can even attach this to your browser and press a button. It'll, you know, keep track of all the sources that you want to keep track of, and it also spits out your references in various formats as well, so making it massively easier to keep track of your sources of information. So yeah, I do recommend checking that out. You can also embed it into Microsoft Word as well, which again makes it much easier to, you know, write a report and properly reference it and provide footnotes and bibliographic references at the end of your reports and things like that. So do check that out. I recommend getting that because it just makes things infinitely easier. You know, you're not having to write every single individual reference each time you write a report. And something I've started using just recently in my new job that I started, well, 2 years ago now. I was completely unaware that Microsoft Word has its own inbuilt source management system, so under references, so you can again keep a list of citations in a bibliography, and then Word will spit these out and you can cross-reference extremely easily. I use this on a daily basis in my current work while I'm writing archaeological reports. It makes things massively easy, and again, I wasn't wasn't aware of this at all. So yeah, check those out, have a play with them. I'm not going to show you how to use these. I'm going to leave that up to you because yeah, it's just easier that way. But have a go with these, get used to using them. As you're starting out, keep track of the information that you are consulting, and also it's worth at this point being objective about what you're reading as well. So yeah, like I've said before, if someone isn't providing references, then be a bit more critical about what you read. If someone is backing something up with a primary source or a reference, then consult that reference and then make your choice and decision after that. But by and large, if someone isn't providing references, then, you know, be a bit more skeptical of what has been written and what you read. And it's, you know, you need to have a bit of an inquisitive mind when it comes to this as well, and a bit of an analytical approach. So I hope you found that useful. I'm just going to finish off with a quick summary of what we're going to look at next time. So next time we're actually going to take a look at creating a very broad ORBAT, or order of battle. So we'll look at that. And also starting to trace Home Forces units using war diaries and command files held in the National Archives. Again, this is probably going to be big video. We're going to focus on the National Archives, in particular the Home Forces war diaries and the command files. And yeah, we'll start to look at how to break down the units that you want to look at a local level to kind of streamline your approach to research. So I've been Chris. I hope that's been useful. Next time we'll actually get to do something a bit more interesting, actually start to consult some source of information, show you how to start trawling source of information to get started. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.